Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. All right, today, folks, we are going to be talking about a largely forgotten sedan that came out of the American car scene in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that sedan would be the Lincoln LS. As you all know, luxury sedans are sort of my thing. There are some guys that are truck guys. There are some guys that are muscle car guys like Mustangs, Challengers, Camaros. Some guys are, Mercedes-Benz guys. I am a general luxury sedan sort of guy. So I tend to focus on luxury sedans throughout the course of this podcast. You've seen a lot of things on luxury sedans, but one thing that really sparked my interest when I did my last podcast on the Jaguar XJ was the Lincoln LS, because I spoke about the Premier Automotive Group, which was Ford's attempt at creating, a separate division within their company solely for luxury cars, which included Jaguar, Land Rover, Lincoln, and Volvo. And now, after doing the podcast on the Jaguar XJ, I'm just very intrigued in seeing some other products that came of this time period, how they fared. And I want to talk to you all today about the Lincoln LS, because the Lincoln LS is largely forgotten amongst, car people. Unless you're like a real car enthusiast, you probably don't think much of the Lincoln LS. Yeah, there's still, some on the road. You might see them in various states of decomposition, but nobody cares about the Lincoln LS. And why is that? Why did the Lincoln LS fail? Why did it only last for one generation? What exactly happened? This is the question we are attempting to answer in today's podcast. So today, in segment 1, we're going to be discussing the history. Segment 2, we're going to be discussing the specifications. In segment 3, we're going to be discussing the numerous failures of the Lincoln LS. And in segment 4, as always, you will hear my thoughts on the whole thing. So let's get started. Okay, so the Lincoln LS. The Lincoln LS was produced from 1999 to 2006. It was produced in 99 for the 2000 model year. So really, it's a 2000 to 2006 car. Just one generation. It was related to the Ford Thunderbird, the Jaguar S-Type, the Jaguar XF, and it was supposed to share the same platform as the 5th generation Ford Mustang, but that was later on in its development was moved on to another platform. And now that we've seen how these cars fared that had that platform, let's just be thankful that the 5th generation Mustang didn't share a platform with this vehicle. It was built on the Ford DEW98 platform. So apparently DE was supposed to denote that it was between the D and E class of cars. So it was between whatever D stands for and the executive class of vehicles. And W was supposed to mean that it was a worldwide platform that was going to be used in several countries. Built on being built on this platform, it was rear-wheel drive. It was developed by Ford and Jaguar, and it was first used in the Lincoln LS. And a fun fact about this platform was the fact that Ford stopped using it in 2006. However, when Jaguar was sold to Tata Motors, they continued to use it. And the Jaguar XF was built on this platform from 2008 to 2015. So the Jaguar XF is actually built on the same platform as the Lincoln LS, which I would have never known if I had done this. I'm thinking that by that time, Jaguar was no longer affiliated with Ford. They were under Tata Motors. They stopped using Ford's platforms, anything from Ford at that point. But I guess not. I guess they continued using the platform. I mean, you spend that much money developing a platform for a car. Just because your company gets sold doesn't mean you don't take what you spent your money on. So I understand that. And what was interesting about the LS was it was Lincoln's first luxury sports sedan. And that is something to say. Because when you think about the history of Lincoln, if I'm not mistaken, was started in 1917, 1920 something. It was started about 90 to 100 years ago now. When you think about it, Lincoln has never created a sporty car. I mean, I guess the sportiest car that Lincoln ever created was probably maybe the Continental Mark 7 and maybe the Lincoln Mark 8. Those are probably the sportiest cars that Lincoln created, and really those weren't even sports cars. Those were personal luxury cars. But the Lincoln LS was designed from the ground up to be a sports sedan. And it even shared many components with the well-known sports sedan of that time period, the Jaguar S-Type. My family actually owned an S-Type of this time period, a 2000 S-Type. It was the worst car we had ever owned, probably. I mean, it was okay. Maybe worst car we had ever owned is a bit of an exaggeration, because I mean, shortly after that, a few years after we had gotten rid of that, we got ourselves a W220 S-Class. That was probably the worst car we've ever owned as far as reliability goes. But if the S-Class is the worst, then the S-Type is probably close behind. It wasn't a good car. I mean, it was pretty. It was real pretty. But even in the state that we bought it, the paint was peeling, the headliner was kind of sagging, in some places it had just completely detached, and the leather, I remember distinctly that the leather seat, the driver's seat, had a huge chunk ripped out of it. I mean, it just wasn't an extremely good investment. We bought it for $2,800. It was supposed to be like our spare car, the car that my stepmom would use to go to work, and it just... it just wasn't that great. It wasn't that great. For the money that we paid for it, we could have gotten something better, frankly. And the fact that it was a Jaguar brought little consolation to it, because we had already owned a bunch of luxury cars before that one. And, to tell you the truth, yes, it's a Jaguar. It's European. It's supposed to be exotic. But, heck, our Cadillac DeVille that we had, even as it began to fall into disrepair, our Cadillac DeVille was 1,000 times better than that car. I mean, the Jaguars seem to always have a problem. One time the brake caliper got detached and cut the tire. Another time we needed catalytic converters. There was another time it was this. There was another time it was that. I mean, the car wasn't that great. It wasn't that great. It was a genuine hoopty, as Tyler Hoovy would say. But anyway, I'm not here to talk about the Jaguar S-Type. I'm here to talk about the Lincoln LS, its American cousin. I would imagine that the Lincoln LS of the time period wasn't that great either. But I wouldn't know, because I've never driven one, and I don't know anybody who owns one. But... yeah, so it shared its platform with the Jaguar S-Type, and it was Lincoln's first luxury sports sedan. The car was supposed to be named the LS6 or the LS8, depending on the number of cylinders the engine had. Now, to all of you car people out there, you will find that this is a shameless copying of Jaguar's nomenclature of the XJ, especially the XJ of that time period. Because as you know, the XJ from the 90s to the 2000s was designated as the XJ6 or the XJ8. Because there was a 6-cylinder variant and there was an 8-cylinder variant. I find it no coincidence at all that Lincoln, the same time when they're in bed with Jaguar, they will come out with the LS that they wanted to name the LS6 or the LS8. It's just a copying of Jaguar's nomenclature, which, American car companies are really shameless. They really are. I mean, anyway, goodness. But, yeah, so... I understand they were both manufactured by Ford at that time period, but you can't have an American car that is just shamelessly stealing the nomenclature of a well-known European brand. I mean, you can't do that. At that point, you're just letting people know that you're in bed with Jaguar. People are not supposed to know. The good thing that's supposed to come from a deal like this, when you're an American company in bed with a European company, what really is supposed to happen? People aren't really supposed to know much about it. All you're there for is basically their technology to make your cars better. But really, if you do it well enough, you'll be able to pull it off without the general public ever knowing that your two brands were ever related, because you all just can't be seen together in public. But like when you're doing something like that, goodness, you're blowing your cover. You're going to tell everybody that Lincoln is having an affair with Jaguar. I mean, you can't be doing that foolishness. No. You can't be doing that. But anyway. Thankfully, the name was simply LS, and if it was an LS with a V6 engine, it was LS V6, it was LS V8 respectively for those with an 8-cylinder model. So thankfully, it was kept as simply LS, and to avoid confusion with the Lexus LS, which at the time period would have been the Lexus LS 430. There was some debate about that, but they ended up, working it out as car companies do. So when the LS was designed, the chief designer, which I thought was really interesting that he said this, who was of German extraction, said in a segment defined and dominated by BMW and Mercedes, the car had to be had to have a functional, no-nonsense look. This redefines the Lincoln brand, but we still had to make sure that it was recognizable as a member of the same family as the Town Car, Continental, Mark 8, and the Navigator. So, essentially, this is basically showing exactly Lincoln's intent at combating the German car companies. When I had said something about the American car companies combating the Germans in several other podcasts that I have done, I should say. One thing I kind of failed to realize was the fact that Lincoln was taking a stab at the Germans too. And I don't think I mentioned that in my podcast, besides that brief concession I made for the Lincoln Mark 7. But as far as the Lincoln brand goes, Lincoln with the LS was aimed squarely at providing similar performance, similar luxury for like half of the price for Mercedes-Benz E-Class or BMW 5 Series. And I just gotta say, y'all, how many E-Classes of the time period do you see from, do you still see on that road, on the road? You still see plenty of them. How many 5 Series you see from that time period? I mean, you don't see a lot, but you see more than you do the Lincoln LS. The Lincoln LS is honestly becoming a rare sight these days, at least where I live. It's hard to find the Lincoln LS. And, well, when we discuss the exact failures of it, you will find out why exactly it's such a difficult car to find. But moving on, despite all of its difficulties, it was named Motor Trend's Car of the Year in the year 2000. So that's kind of like the history of the Lincoln LS. In segment 2, we are going to be discussing the specifications of the Lincoln LS. How long it is, how heavy, what the transmission is like, blah blah blah. All those good tidbits of information that you all will want to know. So please stay tuned.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Welcome back, folks. So in segment 1, we discussed the history of the Lincoln LS. Now we're going to be discussing, we're going to be discussing the specifications. So let's get started. Okay, the Lincoln LS. Why was the Lincoln LS so special for Lincoln? It was rear-wheel drive. It had been decades since the last time Lincoln came out with a rear-wheel drive, sedan, like mid-size sedan. I mean, not to say that, it's like, let me explain myself. When I mean rear-wheel drive mid-size sedan, I know the Town Car and the Continental for the longest while were all rear-wheel drive. But they were body-on-frame construction vehicles. Lincoln, when I'm talking about a rear-wheel drive car is something like a mid-size executive class. It had been years since they had offered that, because their mid-size class now was the Continental, and the Continental for 20 years at this point had been front-wheel drive. So, when was the last time Lincoln had a mid-size executive class vehicle that was rear-wheel drive and that was sport-oriented? The sport-oriented part, never. But, a mid-size sedan with rear-wheel drive, probably the Lincoln Versailles, which by that time, goodness, was, probably the 70s, the 80s. So at this time that we're discussing in the early 2000s was 20, 30 years. It had been decades. And the Lincoln Versailles wasn't even a sporty sedan. Lincoln just didn't do sporty. Sporty was not in Lincoln's vocabulary. But now, here you have the Lincoln LS. Where exactly does it fit? Where exactly does it fit? In a brand that had no previous concessions to sporty vehicles, all of a sudden you have a sporty vehicle. Where does it go? What do you do? How do you market it? How do you maintain it? How do you keep the public interested in it? There's so many things to consider there. But anyway, so nearly 50-50 weight distribution. This car was well known for its nearly 50-50 weight distribution, which makes it an absolutely glorious vehicle, I would imagine, when handling and other things of that sort. Nearly 50, I already said that. Available for V8 or V6, already said that as well. The V6 was initially offered with a manual transmission. And another thing that was crazy, it had been decades since Lincoln offered a manual transmission. At this time period, Lincoln, before the LS, was your American luxury car company that was second best to Cadillac. That's what it was. But now the Lincoln LS, coming in with a vengeance like that was like, whoa, what on earth is that? It must have taken Lincoln buyers by storm, seeing this very European-esque automobile. And I could imagine some people would have seen that thing on the road, would have been like, oh yeah, that's not a Lincoln. Lincolns are old and stuffy. Lincolns are for old people. Well, this wasn't your grandfather's Lincoln. I mean, this Lincoln was producing, almost 300 horsepower in some variants. So let's get this. It had a manual transmission. It had Jaguar engine choices for both the V6 and the V8.
There were several suspension components were made of aluminum, including the hood, front fenders, and deck lid. Another reason why this car was, able to be, I guess, so lightweight and whatnot was because it was partly made of aluminum. Another page out of Jaguar's book. Moving on. The V6 variant made 210 to 220 horsepower from 2000 to 2002. The V8 made 252 horsepower from 2000 to 2002. The LS was facelifted in 2003, and in 2006, the V6 variant was discontinued. 262,900 Lincoln LSs were made from the period of 1999 to 2006. Now, specifications going alone, I really don't see a problem with the Lincoln LS. I mean, we could pull up more stats and say, well, it has this much leg room, it has this much cargo room, blah, 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 all of that. But, it doesn't really matter. Nobody's buying a Lincoln LS to haul their family, their kids, and the children of Israel in it. I mean, it's not that deep. So, with the Lincoln LS, I guess what was the shining point of this car's specifications was the fact that it was basically a Jaguar. It was a Jaguar in Lincoln clothing. And that was, I guess it should have been a huge marketing incentive, a marketing scheme, whatever you want to call it, a marketing campaign probably is what you would call it. It should have been a huge marketing campaign that Lincoln was basically the American Jaguar after they produced the LS. And they really just dropped the ball. I mean, the specifications caused it to be a good car. Yes, there were several quirks, but we haven't gotten there yet. The Lincoln LS was indeed a very good vehicle for what it was. It was an executive mid-size sedan with rear-wheel drive. Lincoln couldn't have let anybody else into that segment as far as American car companies go. And they couldn't have put anything else in that segment. Lincoln was there before Cadillac got to that segment, because Cadillac's mid-size sedan of this time period was still, it was still the Cadillac Seville, a front-wheel drive, basically a front-wheel drive rebodied DeVille. I mean, that's all there was to it, essentially. I mean, the Lincoln LS could run circles around a Cadillac Seville as far as performance goes. It's rear-wheel drive. It has that punch. Of course, I've not driven them, but this is what I would imagine. It would have that punch, and it would just be a luxury sports sedan. A Cadillac couldn't compare to that. So all these specifications right now, yes, they're sparse. There's not many specifications, but they can almost build a picture in your mind what it would have been like. What it would have been like if Lincoln had, made this luxury sedan and, gone forward with it and continued in the route that they were going to. And unfortunately, Lincoln just really dropped the ball on it. So these specifications show you what the Lincoln LS was meant to do on paper and how it performed on paper. Because there's some cars that I would imagine that get performance by accident instead of on purpose. For example, the Rolls-Royce Phantom. This is a far-fetched example, but bear with me. The Rolls-Royce Phantom has performance by accident, not on purpose. It's like, in order for them to move such a hulk of a vehicle, then they had to put a giant motor in it, and then that motor lended itself to being, a Rolls-Royce certified installed motor, blah blah blah, blah blah blah. But the thing is, I lost my train of thought there. But with the Rolls-Royce Phantom, is the fact that it has a lot of this performance, but it's not meant to be a performance vehicle. The Lincoln LS, these specifications show you from the ground up, it was purposely meant to have performance. It was not an accidentally well-performing vehicle. It was well-performing because it was meant to be well-performing. And, that's what sets it apart
from other offerings from American car companies at the time. Because Chrysler, I'm not going to even mention Chrysler, because at this point, Chrysler's midsize sedan was still the 300M, and the cab forward front wheel drive design, that was not anything that the Germans feared would eat out of their sales of like the E-Class here in America. And Cadillac Seville was very large, was, kind of boxy. I mean, it was not a terribly attractive car, to be frank, but the Lincoln LS was very understated, very sleek, European lines, and very, very, very elegant. And that's what really makes a Lincoln LS. Aside from the fact that it performed well, that's what really makes a Lincoln LS. But you will find out soon that the Lincoln LS is really not as great as it looks to be on paper. And that's just the rather unfortunate thing. And, forgive me if I'm jumping ahead a bit, but it's like, this is what happens when American car companies are in cahoots, are canoodling with the German car companies. The two countries couldn't be any different as far as their philosophy for vehicles go. The Germans build a well-built car that is designed to go 150 miles per hour on the Autobahn without falling apart. Americans, on the other hand, like big, comfortable cars that can cruise down the road. They don't care much for interior appointments. They don't care much for, special other features that people that people would want. I mean, it's like the Lincoln LS. The Lincoln LS it's one of those vehicles. It shows you what exactly happens. It shows you the bad side of what happens when the American car companies try to, be in cahoots with the Germans. I mean, it just doesn't work. The German vehicles, like I said, are built like tanks, and, the American car companies are built to cruise down the road. They're built to cruise down the road. They're built to maximize comfort, but not necessarily so much as far as interior quality goes or build quality or other things of that sort. So, you get this weird amalgamation of, American cheapness, but German engineering. Now, when you have German engineering with American cheapness, it's a disaster, because the Germans engineer their cars, but the German engineers don't engineer their cars around cost saving, around how much plastic can we use to save weight or money on metal, because metal is expensive, so we're just going to use plastic instead. The German engineer does not think about that. The German engineer thinks about, look, I want this car to perform. I want this car to be durable, so I'm going to give you the best the best possible, parts for this car, the best possible components. The American car, not so much. So that's what really is the problem with the Lincoln LS. It had German-inspired engineering, but American cheapness, thus causing it to be a failure of reliability. And of course, you'll find that out more in the next segment. And so please stay tuned after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. So, we're going to continue to talk about the Lexus LS. Not the Lexus, the Lincoln LS. You see, this is why, it shouldn't have been named LS in the first place, because of, the confusion of the regular populace, such as I. But anyway, we discussed the history of the Lincoln LS. We discussed the specifications of the Lincoln LS. And I touched in the last segment about, why exactly a combination of American cheapness and German engineering, or German-esque engineering didn't really work well in the early 2000s when so many when so many American manufacturers were looking to merge with not merge, but to use designs inspired by the Europeans. They were using engineering inspired by the Europeans in order to compete with them. And why exactly this didn't work for the Lincoln LS, which ended up leading ultimately to its failure. So you see, the Lincoln LS is a failure, but it didn't fail as a car per se. It failed to impress the public. The car itself was fine compared to what Cadillac was making at the time. I mean, Cadillac with their North Star engine couldn't claim reliability. Lincoln with their LS couldn't claim reliability either. And Chrysler with their 300 or whatever on earth they were making at the time, that was, with the Europeans or European-esque to combat the Europeans, whatever you want to say, couldn't claim reliability either. It's not because the car was unreliable. It's because it got to a point that Lincoln, or really Ford, stopped caring about the vehicle so much. So let me get into some of the problems that people would have with Lincoln LSs before I get into the more philosophical thing about how Ford just stopped caring for the Lincoln LS. So, like I said, in the early 2000s, all of the American car companies were in bed, so to speak, with the European automakers in an attempt to take a chunk out of the European car sales in the U.S. And which, this is just classic American hubris. I mean, the Japanese have American-made cars and from Japanese companies in the United States. For example, the Toyota Camry is an American car made by a Japanese company. The Toyota Corolla, the version that they have here is an American car made by a Japanese company. There are so many America-specific Japanese cars. The Japanese did not come over here in order to take a chunk out of the market segment or whatever. They came over here and they offered an alternative. And they created almost a new segment of vehicles. They created, cheap, fuel-efficient, reliable cars. I mean, that's what they did. Because when the Japanese started having a foothold in America, there was the Toyopet Crown way back in like the 60s. The Toyopet Crown was a failure. I mean, it came and I think they sell like less than 2,000 units in the United States. The Toyopet Crown was a failure. But when they came back years later with the Toyota Corolla, and with the Honda Civic and other sorts of American-inspired vehicles for the American market that weren't sold in Japan. This is when the Japanese began to take a foothold. They weren't trying to copy the Americans. They weren't trying to copy the Europeans. They brought over their own formula, knowing that it would work as an alternative to what the Americans were doing. Where the Americans have failed is that instead of offering their own formula, which they've been doing well for years. For example, the Lincoln Town Car was a classically American vehicle, not inspired by anything else overseas. The Lincoln Town Car was a very, very, very good car, probably the culmination of American engineering. It wasn't fast, it wasn't particularly fancy, but it worked and it sold extremely well and was a very successful automobile. However, the Lincoln LS, with its, I guess, trying to be European, it didn't work. It didn't work. The Americans cannot make a European car. It's not part of us. And that's why they tried and they failed. I mean, the most successful company here that I have mentioned, as far as making a European-esque design, was probably Cadillac, which is under GM. Probably Cadillac. And even then, Cadillac wasn't doing that great of a job because the Cadillac Seville, which was, Cadillac had been trying to blend European engineering and complexity with American styling, and it kind of worked. It worked better than what Ford was trying to do. It worked better than what Chrysler was trying to do, obviously. But when Cadillac was doing this, it's not that their cars were bad. It's just they were still distinctly American. And nobody would have bought a Cadillac Seville if they wanted a Mercedes-Benz E-Class. The two were fundamentally different vehicles. It's not like, oh, here comes the Cadillac Seville, Mercedes-Benz E-Class, be afraid. No. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. It wasn't that sort of thing. It was sort of the thing that it was a mid-size sedan, or at least quote-unquote mid-size. By European standards, it would be a very large sedan, but it was smaller than the DeVille. It had, the complex engineering of the North Star engine, which was reminiscent of complex engineering in Europe, specifically from Germany. But it still had this American boxy design that was trying to be round around the edges that just didn't work very well. And you can find out more about the Cadillac Seville in my podcast, The Cadillac Seville, The Aspiring European. So now, let me get back to the Lincoln LS. The Lincoln LS failed in very much the same way that other American car company or other American cars that tried to be European did. They had a bunch of complex engineering, when American engineering had always been simple and durable, and their cars were comfortable and simple to work on, like the Lincoln Town Car. The Lincoln LS had so many different things wrong with it from the very beginning, just faults from the factory, because it was a bunch of technology, a bunch of engineering that was stuffed into this what was an American car trying to be a European, and it didn't work, because when you don't have that culture of engineering and of building very well-built cars that are meant to go 150 miles per hour down the Autobahn, very robust vehicles that are meant to perform, not just wafted down the highway. Things get kind of dicey, and that's exactly what happened with the Lincoln LS. Let me continue. So, back to what I was saying. Chrysler was with Mercedes-Benz. The Chrysler 300, the Chrysler Crossfire, all European-esque inspired designs. Ford was with Jaguar, the Lincoln LS, the Ford Thunderbird. The Ford Thunderbird of this generation also was a failure. GM was with Opel, which was slightly better, I will say, because GM owned Opel. Opel was not originally a GM mark, but GM owned Opel, took over ownership of Opel at some time back in the, I want to say, 60s or 70s. GM took over Opel. And they took the Opel, I think, it wasn't the Opel Vectra. It was like the Opel Omega. They took it and rebadged it as the Cadillac Catara over here, which, again, was a failure. The Lincoln LS's technology was advanced, like I had said. Well, independent double wishbone suspension, variable valve, variable timed intake cams, which I guess the exhaust cams weren't variable valve, but the intake was. I guess that's supposed to make a difference. I don't know how those things work. And many other things. But just like many other aging European cars from this era, this resulted in reliability issues that were hella expensive to repair. And this is not what Americans expect from an American vehicle. And I think that's part of the reason why the Lincoln LS ended up failing. Because it's like when you think of the Cadillac North Star engine, you had the 4.9 liter V8 that was used in Cadillac up until like 1994 or 1995 or something. And then in 92, they had slowly begun to introduce the North Star into more and more vehicles, to a point where almost all Cadillacs had North Star engines, some variant or another. Now, here's the problem. When you go to buy an American vehicle and you're selling it to American people who want an American vehicle are not going to want something that's trying to be European. If they want something that's European, they're going to buy a European car. Because what would you rather have? Would you rather have a Lincoln LS that has unproven technology in it, or would you rather buy a Mercedes-Benz E-Class? Yes, you're going to pay more for it, but your Mercedes-Benz E-Class will still be running like a top 20 years from then. The Lincoln LS, I see so many more E-classes from that era on the road than I see Lincoln LSs. I mean, last time I saw a Lincoln LS was probably last week. And the time before that, I can't remember. That's how rare they're becoming these days because they're just not reliable. And I guess Lincoln and all the American car companies, they thought that, we could take a chunk out of the German car sales if we make our American cars more like German cars. And to tell you the truth, on paper, that's not a bad idea. But in practicality, it was horrible because you're getting engineers that are used to engineering things like the Lincoln Town Car. Big body-on-frame construction, rear-wheel drive, big old V8 under the hood, very simple to work on, extremely reliable, and will run forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. It's not fast. It's not, it doesn't handle well. It's not a sports vehicle. But as far as a luxury, comfortable cruiser, nobody does that better than the Americans. But the Americans had gotten to a point where, understandably, the Germans are coming in, and then they are infiltrating the market since the 80s with these sporty vehicles. And by sporty, I use that term loosely. An S-Class from the era is hardly considered sporty. But when you take an S-Class, which is like the flagship German luxury sedan, versus a Cadillac DeVille, I mean, the S-Class is extremely sporty versus the Cadillac DeVille. Because Americans were not making cars that were both sporty and luxurious. You could either have a sports car or you could have a luxury car. The Germans were the ones who merged the two together. They started doing that in the 80s when they came to America. They're like, okay, instead of going the cheap route like the Japanese did, we're going to go the luxurious route. We're going to offer a car that's the same size as an American car, but feels half the size when you're driving it. It's not going to be a boat. It's not going to pitch and yaw when it's turning around corners and, the body roll is excessive and you feel like you're going to fall out of your seat because it's not supportive. It's just one big old leather bench across the front. No. The Germans did not think like that. When the Americans tried to do it, they end up coming up with failures like the North Star engine and like the Lincoln LS. So let me tell you what about the Lincoln LS made it so bad, essentially. There were ABS system faults. The ABS system on the Lincoln LS, I heard from a YouTube video. Of course, I don't know because I've never driven one of these. But I heard that these things would get so expensive to fix that some owners opted driving the cars without ABS because frequently when the ABS system would fail or would have faults, it was more than what the car was worth, or it was just not worth fixing because it was just going to break again. So they drove their cars without ABS, which is a problem. You shouldn't have people driving your car without anti-lock brakes. I mean, that's a very big problem. So they had coil pack issues. They had this, instead of a spark plug and a spark plug wire coming from like a distributor, like, some older fashioned engines, they had coil on plug designs, which was, from my knowledge, the first time a Lincoln car ever had one of these. And again, the Lincoln LS was a very influential car, was a lot of firsts. But did Lincoln stick with any of that? Nah, not really. I mean, the Zephyr, which turned to the MKZ afterward, was basically just a rebadged Ford Fusion. It was built on the same platform with the simple technology like the Ford Fusion. The Lincoln MKS, which replaced the town car, was just a Ford Taurus with a Lincoln body on top of it. They didn't really continue with the line. There wasn't a direct successor to the Lincoln LS afterward. Because Lincoln, I guess, after their earnest attempt to take a chunk out of the German car market in America, after it failed as miserably as the Lincoln LS did, I don't think they continued to try. And even to this day, Lincoln doesn't have any sporty vehicles. Lincoln has a Continental, but the Continental has been discontinued. Lincoln is only making crossovers now. They've got the Nautilus, the Aviator, and the Corsair. And, of course, they've got the full-size Navigator, which is not a crossover. It's an SUV. That's all that Lincoln has left. And Lincoln is probably the last bastion of pure American inspired luxury, because Cadillac has gone the full European route. They don't even have real names anymore. All of their things are alphanumeric, just like the Europeans. The only thing that Cadillac has that's probably purely American is the Escalade. I mean, they've got a CT4, a CT5, a CT6. I'm not even sure if they still have the CT6. They've got an XT4, XT5, XT6, and then they've got an Escalade. You know, CT is a car like a sedan or a coupe, and then XT is a crossover, and then of course the Escalade is a full-size SUV. And their cars are real sporty. They've got the V series, which I guess would be comparable to like the AMG series for Mercedes-Benz or the M series for BMW. Cadillac has really gone the full European route. But Lincoln, after creating the LS, they just gave up. They just gave up. And to tell you the truth, if I had created a car like the Lincoln LS, I would have given up too, because it's just not what it should have been. It's just not what it should have been. I mean, they tried taking a page out of Jaguar's book with having it on a Jaguar platform, a Jaguar engineered engine, things of that sort. And of course, you know, some aluminum body panels, just like Jaguars of the time period had. But you have to also think, if you're going to be combating European luxury, Jaguar is not really the way to go. I know I just spent a whole entire podcast before this praising Jaguar and say, yes, the Jaguar XJ is great. The Jaguar XJ is that. But the Jaguar XJ was mostly engineered by Ford. That wasn't really a European thing. I mean, it was a European luxury car, but that had it was adopted by Americans. It's like if you adopt a European child and you raise them in America, are they really European at that point? It's like, is the Jaguar XJ really European? At least the X350 and the X358 generations? Is it really European though? I mean, it's of a European company. It has European heritage, but it was born and raised here in America. I mean, it's American. It's American. And it's a good alternative, but nobody's saying that the Jaguar XJ outsold Mercedes-Benz's S-Class or BMW 7 Series. Did it last longer than them? Yes, it did, but it didn't outsell them. It wasn't as popular. So if you're going to try to imitate a European brand, Jaguar's not really the way to go. Jaguar's not the most successful European brand, if you know what I mean. I mean, they don't have that great of a reputation. They've got a great racing heritage, but as far as, reliability or engineering, Jaguar is not known for those things, at least not here in the States. So, that was a red flag from the beginning when Lincoln LS was, basically sharing platform and canoodling with Jaguar S-Type. I mean, that just, that just wouldn't work. And not only that, coil pack issues, leaking cooling systems, because they add this complex cooling system, but get this, in order to save weight, like the Jaguar, add lightness. In order to save weight, they made the cooling system hoses and other things out of cheap rubber and cheap plastic. Well, after 10, 15 years, especially if you live in a hot environment like Florida, those things begin to crack. Those things begin to split. They begin to burst. Same thing happened to my Buick Park Avenue. My Buick Park Avenue has been in Florida for most of its life. All the time, I've got a vacuum hose that's rotted away and that needs to be replaced. Or I've got a plastic tube that's gone brittle and that's broken underneath the hood. I mean, there's always something because of the cheap plastic and the cheap rubber that they use. It's old. It's old, and it gets old quickly, especially in the heat of the environment. And not only that, the heat of the engine. You could even live in Alaska. The heat of the engine will cause those things to crack after a while. So that's another issue. Dual coolant control valve, that's another thing. They had this complex thing called a dual coolant control valve. Sometimes those things would seize and not allow coolant to flow into the engine. Transmission shift solenoid failures. Hydraulic fan failures. Get this. The electrical system of the car was not able to accommodate an electric fan, so they had the fan to cool down the radiator, to cool down the engine, blah, blah, blah. They had the fan hydraulically powered. And of course, a hydraulic fan is not something you see on automobiles. So this was the only car I've ever heard of that had a hydraulic fan. What happened? The hydraulic fan failed because it was the first time they had ever done something like this, and it was untried. There are literally conversion kits to convert these things to electric fans so that they may not fail. I mean, this is how This is how much technology they put into this thing in order to make it seem, fresh, cliche and European and other things of that sort. And, it's a European American car. I mean, it's sophisticated, other things of that sort. Yeah, it might have been sophisticated when it's working. One thing you will know about the Germans may not build the most reliable vehicles because of, they just go overboard with the technology. But do they make durable vehicles? Yes. I've seen a Mercedes-Benz 300D rotting away in the junkyard, and I look at the leather seats. The leather seats don't even have a crack in them. The leather seats, despite being a little bit dusty, look brand spanking new. That's German build quality for you. The cars their parts last forever. They may fail as a result of electrical issues or some sort of engineering failure. But as far as the body of the car, the body of, the materials that they use, they last forever. German cars are extremely durable. You cannot have a car that's legitimately going to compete against Germans and then you have plastic cooling tubes in it and a hydraulic fan because it was too expensive to upgrade the electrical system of the car. If you're going to try to combat the Europeans, then you cannot write things into your car with a price in mind. You have to engineer the car with a blank check. Make it as engineeringly, I just made up that word. Make it as robust engineering-wise as you can, and don't worry about the cost until the car is finished produced. That's how German cars used to be, especially the German cars right around this era. You see what I'm talking about? It was a German-inspired car with an American budget and American cheapness. It was a disaster. It wasn't going to work. That's why it ended up failing. And not only that, the car was forgotten by Ford. Ford did a facelift in 2003. It barely made a difference. Sales began to slump, and eventually they axed it in 2006. It just wasn't viable. It wasn't cost effective at that point anymore to keep the car going. It was a nice page in Lincoln's history where they finally made an earnest effort to combat the European luxury powerhouses, and they failed. But they took that failure in stride, and they were like, you know what? We tried, we failed, we're just not going to try again. Because some things we're just not meant to do. And Lincoln is not meant to make European-inspired luxury cars. They're meant to be the last bastion of American luxury that exists in the American car market. And for that, I applaud them. You tried something, you took your failure in stride, and instead of hopelessly trying again, you moved on to something you know how to do. Because sometimes in life, there are certain battles that are just not worth fighting. And the Lincoln LS fighting the likes of the Mercedes-Benz E-Class and the BMW 5 Series, that's not a fight worth fighting. Cadillac, if you want to do that, go ahead. But Lincoln is pulling out of the game, and Lincoln will remain a luxury car company for Americans, designed by Americans, and inspired by Americans. And that's how it ought to be. Because not every American car company needs to be in bed or chasing the Europeans. Anyway, moving on. So we're going to discuss my own personal thoughts in segment 4. So please stay tuned.
You work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
All right, folks. So, here we've discussed everything in the, that has to do with the Lincoln LS. We've discussed the history. We've discussed the specifications. We've discussed, oh my goodness, we've discussed the failures. Now I'm going to discuss my own thoughts. I know that last segment was kind of harsh, concerning the Lincoln LS. But to tell you the truth, I find this car endearing. And the reason why I find it endearing is because it's weird. It's weird. It's special. Because it's not like this car is something that Lincoln always made. It's not like something that Lincoln always makes. It's not something that it's not something that is commonplace. A Lincoln LS is something special because they were so unreliable. The fact that you still see one on the road today is a special occasion. For example, I saw at my new job, because I'm a district manager for valet living, and then what we do, we go around to apartment complexes and we do maintenance and other things of that sort, trash pickup, other things of that sort. So I was, doing, I think I was dealing with a customer complaint or something. I was pulling up to an apartment complex, and I saw, in the parking lot, I saw a really nice Cadillac DeVille. But a few parking spaces down, I saw a BMW 7 Series from the Bangle Butt era, and I was like, whoa. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so surprised that thing is still on the road. Because those things are dwindling quickly. I mean, it's so difficult. I can go an entire week without seeing a BMW 7 Series from that era. And I live in Southwest Florida, where we have multi-million-dollar homes in my neighborhood, where we have celebrities that own houses an hour away from where I live. I live in Southwest Florida, so you would expect to see all these expensive luxuries today. It is so hard to find a BMW 7 Series from the early to mid 2000s. It's just, they just didn't last. They just didn't last. They were not well built. They were not well engineered. They were not well made. They were not reliable. So now I saw this. And the way I feel about that is the same way I feel when I see a Lincoln LS. I remember as a kid going to a mechanic shop. We've got a great a family friend of ours. His name is Alexis. He's Haitian, and he has a small used car lot and also a mechanic shop down in Fort Myers. And I remember going there as a kid and then seeing a Lincoln LS in the shop. And at this time, this might have been 2008, 2009, perhaps. And then we saw the Lincoln LS, and then he made a comment. He's like, this thing's a piece of junk. And then here am I years later doing this podcast on the Lincoln LS, and that's made an impression on me. Since then, I knew those cars weren't bad. And just keep in mind, if that was like, let's be generous and say it was 2011. That car would have been, at its oldest, 11 years old, and at its newest, 5 years old. Because they made them from 2000 to 2006. So we're talking about a 5 to 10-year-old car already in the state of it's junk, it's no longer worth keeping because it's too expensive to fix. And it's sitting at a mechanic shop about to be mechanically totaled. And that car was 5 to 10 years old at the time. So now here we are, fast forward in 2021, where these cars are classic cars, the oldest of them, because a classic car has to be 20 years old. So if you buy a 2000 Lincoln LS, you're buying a 21-year-old car. That is a classic car. When these cars are beginning to gain classic status, it's something special when you see a Lincoln LS. It's something special. To the average layman person, it might not be special, but to me, a car enthusiast, knowing my car history, knowing what a failure that thing was, to still see it running is a miracle. It's nothing short of a miracle. With German-inspired engineering and cheap American parts, I mean, wow. The fact that it's still running, it must have like only 50,000 miles on it. They must have never driven it. Because I couldn't imagine having 200,000 miles on. I just can't imagine that. So when I see a Lincoln LS, it's something special. So that's how I feel about it. It's endearing, it's something special, it's charming. Will I ever own one? Possibly. I like quirky American luxury cars, but like it's not on my bucket list of cars to buy. I want to buy either Mercedes-Benz E350 wagon or a Jaguar XJ, maybe a Toyota Crown Majesta because there's this guy on Facebook selling one. Don't go out and buy it. But then again, you all don't know where it is anyway. So like maybe one of those three cars, which I know those three cars are good. But like, you know, when I see a Lincoln LS, it's sort of endearing. Another thing, I don't hate the Lincoln LS. I recognize that it was a failure, but I don't hate it. Because the thing is, every car enthusiast has, you know, a guilty pleasure, pick their poison sort of thing. My poison happens to be the North Star engine. I love Cadillac DeVille's, and I love Cadillacs with the North Star engine. I love the North Star engine. Is it a good engine? Not really. Is it unreliable? Yes. Have I been burned before by a North Star engine? Absolutely. But like literally and figuratively. But I just love these engines. I can't help myself. I love the North Star engine. Was the North Star engine better than the engine they put in the Lincoln LS? Hardly. They both had problems. North Stars, if it wasn't a failing water pump, it was a bad head gasket. If it wasn't a bad head gasket, it was a leaking oil pan. If it wasn't a leaking oil pan, it was the car was burning oil. If it wasn't burning oil, it was overheating. If it wasn't overheating, the alternator was going out, which, by the way, was a $500 job minimum because they had to remove the radiator and remove the front wheel to get underneath the car to get the alternator. I mean, like, if it wasn't one thing, it was another. So, like, can I hate the Lincoln LS if I love the North Star engine? Not really. I would be hypocritical because the Lincoln LS has also a bunch of issues that, you know, come with the car from the factory that manifest themselves in old age. I mean, it's the same deal. There was a failure from Cadillac and a failure from Lincoln. And where I have to fault Cadillac, the North Star engine was such a bad engine, at least the early version, that there is literally a company out of Canada called North Star Performance that makes their bread and butter, makes their money on repairing old North Star engines. You know you done screwed up when you design an engine that's so complicated and so fragile that so many of them break, that there is a company that 30 years after the engine was first introduced is still making money on repairing those engines. It's ridiculous. GM, I have to, you know, commend GM for the fact that they stuck with the North Star. And then they continued, you know, to improve it. They continued to apply it to different vehicles. They made a rear-wheel drive version of it. They had so many different versions of the North Star. They revised the head bolt design, and they made it more aggressive, at least the threads on the head bolt, so that it would bite into the block better and, you know, have less risk of being stripped. But there were certain things that a North Star engine would just do. By virtue of design, you just couldn't get rid of it. And, like, they kept the North Star engine from 1992 to 2011. From 92 to 2011, knowing all those dang problems that the North Star engine used to give. The Lincoln, on the other hand, Lincoln has always been, you know, at least in modern times, a luxury car company that played it safe. As far as Lincoln's value in the market, Lincoln was between Buick and Cadillac. Not quite at Cadillac's level. I would say closer to Buick's level than it was to Cadillac's level, but it was all what Ford had. Ford tried making a car with expensive engineering and slapping the Lincoln badge on it and then calling it the Lincoln LS. Ford failed at doing that. Do you know what Ford did? Instead of denying the fact that their car was a failure and then coming out with a second generation Lincoln LS with the problems of the first, they discontinued it. Because Lincoln saw the writing on the wall. Lincoln saw that it was just not meant to be. It was just not meant to be. They just were not meant to have a car that competed directly with European luxury cars. And that was okay for them. Because now, I will tell you, Who is Lincoln's competitor? Lincoln's competitor is probably Buick. Buick is probably the American luxury segment of GM now, because Cadillac still exists, but Cadillac's cars are heavily European inspired. And if Lincoln still made sedans, who would be their chief rivals? Probably Genesis, because Genesis is still unashamedly, or at least not even still, has recently, within the past 5-6 years, started to make very, American luxury-like vehicles that are not so concerned with sport, but are concerned more with luxury than anything else. They're making very American-inspired vehicles, and I guess Genesis would be like the new Lincoln, in a sense, as far as sedans go, because they have the G90, the G80, the G70. G70 is a bit smaller. It's a bit, sporty. But they have those. And they're not expensive. And they're very luxurious. And they're not particularly sporty either. That's kind of like the market segment that Lincoln had filled. That's kind of like the market segment that Buick had filled. Not too terribly expensive, still semi-luxurious, and not exactly focused on sport, but more focused on luxury. That's kind of how Buick was. That's kind of how Lincoln was. That's kind of how Mercury was. And then Genesis has begun to fill that void. Now that Mercury's dead, Buick is no longer making sedans, neither is Lincoln. As far as the Lincoln LS, though, the Lincoln LS was a noble effort. It was a noble effort. Was it a failure? Absolutely. But did Ford learn from its lesson? Yes, it did. And I will have to commend the Ford Motor Company for pulling the Lincoln LS when it did, instead of basically wasting money into a car that just was never going to perform as well as the Europeans. Cadillac is getting to the point where it's nipping at the heels of the Europeans. In some cases, I'd rather have like a Cadillac CTS-V than E55 AMG or whatever, if they even still make that version of the AMG. So Cadillac has gotten there. Cadillac has gotten there. But Lincoln was like, nah, I don't need to. I'm fine where I am. It was content with where it was. I heard a sermon about being content earlier today. So Lincoln did that, and I have to commend them for doing so. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I've been your host, David Lucy Mabel. Please follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and listen to us on Apple Podcast, Spreaker, Spotify, any of those podcast apps all out there. You will not regret listening to us. And please tell your friends and your family as well. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.